We all have our preferences, and so do many of our applications, including Unity. And when building our games, we are setting those preferences to make our development the most efficient it can be. So let me show you how to create preferences in line with the way Unity does it. So as an introduction, if you haven't already seen them, you can get to the Unity preferences by clicking the Edit Preferences option, which brings up this window. We are going to add our own to this extensive list, and I'm going to demonstrate using a tool that I developed in a previous video. But don't worry if you haven't watched it yet, as the tool itself is irrelevant to the context of this video. I will, however, leave a link in the description if you want to add a scene quick selection overlay to your toolset. And let me know in the comments if you're following along with the progression of that tool and how you're getting on. So just for context, here is the overlay menu that we're going to be altering. At the moment, it loads in other scenes, and it loads them in either a single or additive manner. Now, sometimes when we're in our projects, we won't want to use that additive. We just want to load things in single. So we're going to make a preference option that enables us to turn this menu on and off. Let's create a script. And we're going to call this script Scene Selection Overlay Settings Provider. There we go. And we'll open that up in Visual Studio. Now here, we're going to actually be deriving from Settings Provider for this one, which comes from, yep, you guessed it, the Unity editor. Now we won't need any of that, and we won't need any of that model behavior stuff. First thing we're going to do is we're going to create the constructor for this, because that is what is needed for a settings provider to start off with. So we'll start that up. And this is actually going to take in two things. The path, and that's the path where it will lie in the preferences, and also the scope. Whether these preferences are for the user or whether they're for the project. And the differences are obvious there. So this will then pass those preferences on to the base. So path and scope, and then we'll close it out. We won't need to put anything into the actual constructor itself. Now, next thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to override the onGUI functionality because we're going to need to draw it, obviously. And we're going to be creating a toggle to show. But as you know, I like to give a little bit of space after a heading before I start making toggles, because I like things nice and neat. Now, the toggle is going to need a value, and we're also going to need a value in the script that's going to look at whether this preference is set. So before we write that, let's write a static bool that passes back whether this actual setting we're going to use is enabled or not. So we'll do a public static bool, and we're going to call this additive option enabled. There we go. And this will have a getter, which will basically return. And I'm going to use editor prefs here because they're nice and simple, but you could actually have this go and get a file if you wanted that was a little bit more complex than the bool for your settings. And then in the onGUI, you could break that up to what it could be. But here, we're going to make it nice and simple, and we're going to use a get bool. Now, obviously, I'm going to need a string to pass into that as a key. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put in a little constant up top here because I'm going to need to do a getter and a setter for this. And additive scene option. There we go. So in here, I'll put get, and I'm going to default it to true, but you could default it to false if you wanted. There we go. And the next thing is we're going to write our setter. So editor prefs, set bool, the constant, and the value being passed in. There we go. So that's our getter and setter. So now we have that, we can start writing our toggle. Now, the first thing we want to do is we want to see if it's enabled, and then we're going to need to compare it. So we'll come down here and we'll get this bool that we just set. And the next thing we'll do is we'll write our toggle. So equals editor GUI layout dot toggle, and we're going to need to put some descriptive text in here. Additive option, comma, enabled. And then we'll make it nice and neat by putting in some width to make sure it doesn't just span over the entire thing. Width. And we'll set that to like 200. There we go. Okay, so that's our toggle done. Now we're going to need to do a comparison to see if we've actually set it. So if enabled does not equal value, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to set it. So we'll do additive option enabled equals value. There we go. So now that can be set. The last thing we want to do is we want to tell Unity this is a settings provider. And what we'll do for that is we'll actually use the attribute settings provider. And this is a very simple piece of code that's going to create our settings provider for us and pass it back. And we'll just call it create settings provider. There we go. Now what we're going to need to do is obviously create that settings provider. So we'll return a new, oh, not that, a new, and this will be the constructor here. And what we'll do is we'll pass it in where we want it to be. Now I'm going to have my own sub menu here because I like to keep my stuff distinct from Unity. And I'm going to call this obviously scene selection overlay. And the next thing we're going to do is provide the scope. Now I'm actually only interested in this being user scoped. So that's what I'm going to provide there. And that's it. That's our settings provider script done. If I save this and I come back into Unity, then on my preferences tab here, you'll see suddenly I have tools and I have my scene selection overlay and I have my additive option all ticked right there. But obviously we need to use that. So let's jump into our other script. And if you go back to the other videos, you'll see this. It's pretty obvious what I'm going to do here. So if scene selection overlay settings provider, if that option is set, do that. Else we'll take this line. And this is just not going to have any of this in here. There we go. That's it. That's all we need to do in our script to update it. Now if I come back into Unity, I go into my scene, I press down and I can see that I've got the options. I come into preferences, I tick this off, come back into scene, and now when I click the drop down, the option's gone. We don't have the submenus for single or additive. We basically just have the straightforward single launching. And now you have all you need to create your own preference pages and the ability to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And I bet you'll have a preference for the next video shown here.